But pleasure in introducing Tim, our speaker, who came in very much the last moment. Tim, it sort of came along, and we're really nice, but he filled in a hole we had in our program at fairly short notice. I won't introduce him more than to say he could be talking about agriculture and politics and things like that, because I think he's going to, one of his slides tells you all about him, what he's going to talk about, and his qualifications for doing it, which are pretty impressive. So over to you.
Well, thank you, Richard. If everyone is comfortable, I need some words of explanation. First of all, to check, can you all hear me? Yes. Secondly, you may have noticed that I'm sitting down. It's not some obscure ritual. It's a really quite difficult attack of gout last week, which I'm now getting over, but I think I'm in the better place, as I say. Now, before I introduce myself, it is always extremely exciting to come and talk to an audience. And of course, I don't do that, don't get out quite so much this week. But you might be amused to know the story of which was circulated around New College, Oxford, when I was there. I think it was about Lord David Cecil, who possibly some of you might just about remember. In the early days of talks on the BBC, after the Second World War, he had a letter of thanks for doing the talk, and saying your fee will be 5 guineas. He said, not at all. I've very much enjoyed myself coming. I enclose my cheque. It's touching. It wouldn't happen these days, I think. Anyway, that by way of explanation, by way of thanks very much to Richard and the team who are actually doing the IT for me, to John McCormick in distant Melbourne, whereas to use my invariable phrase about places in the Commonwealth, where of course I have a cousin. But before that, he did a great deal of work in helping me mold this into shape. I also would like to thank my daughter Caroline, who, unlike me, is actually rather IT savvy, and she pointed out to me when she delighted me by putting all the slides on. You know, I used to do this for a living, but she has a toddler, so she can't be here tonight. Tony, who's driven me, and all the team here, thank you. It is fun to come, and I hope you all have fun, which is the spirit in which I'm offering this. And the reason I'm here, apart from having been sort of signed up as a member last year, is I lived a very variegated life, as I hit 80 later this year. And this talk attempts to draw some themes together. We've got farmers, society, and policy. And I put the list in that order to emphasize that in my world, farmers come first, followed by scientists interfacing with farmers. And then with policy and the political world, it was the third leg of the stool. I think I might slightly have implied there's a fourth leg as well. It's always good to have a backup. I think it is your family, actually. Some of you will know our oldest daughter, Victoria Prentice, because she happens to be your FP, and of which more anon very briefly at the end. Caroline does the IT, and Emily does the general organisation of my world, having been widowed.
Slide 3.
Yeah, slide 2 is just from my guide because it's the structure. Slide 3 is who am I?
Okay.
We've gone back because I'm not Jonathan Swift, so I need to get back one. Who am I? My name is Tim Boswell. For my sins, I'm a politician. It's a terrible admission to make. I'll make a full apology later. I represented the good people of Daventry for rather over 2 decades. Daventry being a place, apart from being a town, which goes from where I live at Ainhoe, right at one end, because that is Northamptonshire, all the way to Sivertoft, which is nearly in Market Harbour at the other, 44 miles. I sat on a number of parliamentary select committees and indeed had time as a minister, including, and I'll refer back to this in a minute, actually the Science and Technology Committee in the House of Commons. But my focus and my passion has always been about agriculture. And I'll intersperse with a few anecdotes when I think you're flagging where I am. I used to tell a good story about my father, who, and all the families I'll explain, they were all market gardeners originally in the Evesham area, but it didn't end there. And he planted a field of cabbages in the rows, so in the rows one morning, and was observed in the evening striking a match to see if they'd chitted. That's enthusiasm for you. Next slide, please. I don't think we need any more biography, but you can come to it later. Some quotes to kick off with, really. First of all, are you all right with that? I can use the mic.
They should be picking it up.
Is that all right for everyone? And this is a short episode. The first quotation, who recognizes the author? There he is, Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels. Whoever could make 2 ears of corn or 2 blades of grass grow upon a spot of ground where only one grew before, he deserved better of mankind and do more essential service to his country than the whole race of politicians put together. Most people are agreeing with that. Could we just click through to the follow-up slide? Yeah, it's the motto of the Royal Agricultural Society of England, still independent of government, practiced with science, which I think is as good a phrase challenging the doctrine of separate theory and practice as I've ever found. I might just say at that point, I very much admire many of the intellectual aspects of Germany and others. But this idea of theory and praxis is a little bit unwise, I think. Now, if we can go on to the next slide. Yeah, we've now arrived at farmers and individualists. And John McCormick, who did a lot to help me formulate this initiative, had an unusual slide of people on a beach enjoying themselves there, but I thought you'd rather have an agricultural reference. I perhaps should just mention who they are first. On the left is my late father, Eric Boswell, and on the right is somebody you might have heard of. No, I'm sorry, I'm the wrong way around because I'm at an angle. Eric on the right, and Ernest Doe, who was a great tract man, ran a very large-scale farm machinery business in the eastern counties, which is still going on, and was a very keen shot and a very good friend of my father's on the left. And that is really a picture of 2 country people enjoying their recreation, but I think also being competitive in their separate ways. And my message at this point is to say farmers are individualists, and yet they're very competitive. They're quite happy to pick each other's brains, but they don't like to be outdone. Some of you will remember that very hot year, 1976, which I like to think of as an early sign or a dry run for global warming. Crops matured very early, well ahead of the usual harvest date. And one of my neighbours in the Cherwell Valley, because the farm in Ainwood goes down to the River Cherwell, and that is in the bit that is Northamptonshire, but one of the farmers in Oxfordshire decided to show off. He put his combine in to harvest winter barley on the last day of June. Never done around here. Within less than half an hour, his brother-in-law, who farmed a little further down the valley, spotted the combine coming out, and he got his own combine into action for another record start. You don't leave too much. For the record, I think we started on July the 4th. Yes. But that's the sort of train of mind, I think, of farmers. Next slide, please. This is a bit wordy, but it's intended to bring up one or two points which we can do. We can do it clicking through, but we won't write. I think I'll do the talk on this and then we'll take it from there. There have always been real national trading pathways, and there still are, like the sheep grown on the northern hills and in Wales, which are crossbred with specialist rams. You wouldn't keep blue-faced Leicesters other than to be what they call the terminal sire. It's not like terminal illness. It's the it's the sire of the ewe that is then crossed with something more mutton or lamb related. And they supplied breeding flocks in this area. I used to go and buy my own mules, as they were called, which is the local nickname. They weren't North Country ones latterly. They were actually Welsh ones. My wife's being Welsh. I used to go and buy them myself in Boswell. It wasn't just the national trading pathways. There were international trading links shown by the Cotswold rule churches, built on the profits of foreign trade, assisted, I may say, by royal export bounties or subsidies. Even before that, England had a very handy line in wheat exports to the Roman army of the Rhine. So you're going back to the early years of the Christian era. Although I think, as I was working on this at the time, we never actually achieved an exportable wheat surplus again until 1985 AD. Of course, these trading experiences were not just about getting rid of your produce, but they helped to fix commercial practices like credit, letters of credit, and the interchange of ideas. You can imagine a few farmers going to Lille or Arras or somewhere and being able to communicate and say, how do you do that? Or why have you done that? My father once had a very interesting conversation on a very hot day outside Rome. And his Italian was not very extensive. And he found the farmer, they sort of shook hands and embraced. And he said, Inghilterra, aqua, and communicated perfectly well with him. So it can. And this interchange of ideas persisted to modern times. I can remember from my very early years running ANO after Dad died in 1974, looking at the rival wheat-growing philosophies of Professor Lalou, who was a professor at Gembloux in Belgium, and the German Dr. Effland, who came from Kiel. He was always a little bit regretful because you could look across the Bight to what was then East Germany, which is where his farm had been confiscated by the Russians. But he was rather a fine character. And I, from what I've suggested, found myself on a farmer's trip to Schleswig-Holstein one day, where he was now practicing his agronomy. And of course, one of the company, not me, renamed it, but I didn't think to his face, Dr. Effluent, which I never really recovered from. Let's go on to the next slide, please. Have we clicked through those? Yeah, we have, I think. Yeah, that's right. Now, we've rather changed personalities here. This is the beginning of the story of how the Boswell family, and in fact, my maternal side, the Jones family, moved from the Vale of Evesham and found themselves in Essex. Now, in 1930, the American Henry Ford of Ford cars and Model T, and of course of the tractors, the Fordson tractors, came to Europe to inspect his factories. And then he was coming back on the, I think, the boat train from Harwich to London. Saw a large slug of fairly subused land near Chelmsford, in Essex, and said in the sort of way that you do if you're a magnate, buy it. We're going to put some people to work on it. And that simply is how things started. I think we'll click through at this point. And this may all Dick and dive about, but I'll refer to it. At that time, the English Ford Company was a separate company, chaired by a man called Sir Percival Perry, who became Lord Perry. We'll see him in his robes in a minute. He'd actually been a minister for munitions in the Lloyd George coalition government in World War I. Sorry, we're going to have to hear about Lloyd George in a minute as well. Ford was quite opinionated, to put it quite strongly, and he wanted to do something about unemployment. So he really did buy this 2,000-acre plus semi-derelict estate in Essex, with the intention of creating a labour-intensive market gardening enterprise. It was less than 30 miles away from Ford's car plant at Dagenham. After some initial problems, he asked Perry for advice. He wanted somebody to come and sort it. And this was passed on to another contact of theirs, because of course, it's not unusual in government, the network is quite small. And Mr. Smedley of the Canning firm, who made some inquiries in the Evesham area. And I think at that point, we go on to this slide and just say, I thought it might be quite revealing for you to know a bit about this. And it's, you know, how I ended up in Essex when I never should have done that. Well, my maternal grandfather, George Jones, the man standing there, was invited as a consultant by him. Smedley said, this is the man you need to get. He's sort of just experienced market gardener, about to retire, get him in Essex and get him sorted out. But then he fell ill quite prematurely, as people did in those days. So he enlisted his son-in-law, my father, Eric Boswell, who you've already seen, to help him out. So Dad sold his own small farm in Perth, moved house and possession to Essex by train. That's what you did in those days. I think we click through now. I'm just whether it's 4 minutes. Well, it doesn't really matter here. But
Do you want the next slide?
Not the whole next slide. I think we'll leave it there actually, and I'll submit to this. Now, on my grandfather's death in 1937, Eric, my father, took over as general manager. This is before I sadly. And he stayed on in that place all through World War II and into the 1950s. Dad then moved to his own farm in Essex, which is now the Chelmsford Racing. And he'd always wanted to get back to his roots in the Devon, but not too near your cousin, if possible. So he bought our present farm at Avon in 1967 at an accessible but respectable distance from his many siblings and cousins. And he celebrated his return to the Midlands by planting out an orchard of 11 acres of plum trees. We no longer have them, which was an exciting experience at the time. What is relevant to the third topic of this report, the question of really politics, is this market gardener, or these two market gardeners, my father-in-law and my dad, both knew a lot of technology. For example, in Essex, my father grew a sample of asparagus. And it was rather like, I think, the only time in history the Spartan army was ever defeated by another Greek army in the Battle of Plataea. I'm sure you know about that. 371. It caused a complete collapse of morale in Sparta. Well, the idea of somebody coming from outside to win the Evesham asparagus competition was unthinkable. And I think they comforted themselves by saying it's really one of ours. Anyway, I just make that. He knew asparagus, cabbages, plums, but he found himself drawn unconsciously perhaps into the world of big business and high politics. I mentioned some names already. Certainly as it affected food production. And that was vital, and his expertise was tapped on a bit officially in Whitehall during the shipping blockades of World War II. A bit like Jonathan Swift, we're still talking about the utility of somebody who can make 2 blades of grass grow where 1 grew before. Pre-1939, we were dependent on imports for 2/3 of our food supplies. We eventually got all our ration supplied from home produce, just about. And through this network, involving people like Ford and Perry, he found himself called up to Whitehall to advise on film production. Now we click through to the next slide, and I did mention and trail that I was going to show you somebody, so I can tell you it might.
There you go.
There you are. Somebody in the middle of that. I think if you ask as it were, a young voter audience, if they have any recognition of the man in the middle of that picture, they probably don't. It's David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister in the First World War. And for the record, there is not actually a Boswell in that picture, but the one in the sort of blazer, second from the left, is actually a cousin. I used occasionally to warn Victoria when she went down on horticultural business in her present job to the Vale of Evesham. I said, you must understand if anyone's called Boswell, Bean, Careless or Bird, they're almost certainly already related. And so she knew that. Anyway, the result of that little bit of the network was my father paid a regular annual visit to Lloyd George's retirement estate at Churt in Surrey for the purpose of pruning his fruit trees. So I can claim my father knew Lloyd George, but not my mother. Well, but by way of documentary evidence, and this is so precious, I'm not going to let it out of my pocket. I have a little book here, which you're welcome to look at afterwards, called Cobbett's Legacy to Landowners. And in the flyleaf is the autograph signature of its owner and clearly heavy user, David Lloyd George, which came my father's way. I have to admit, when I was talking to son-in-law Sebastian, who's married to Victoria, he did say rather quietly, of course, you probably don't know, but I'm actually a Cobbett. His name is Prentice, but he's descended from. So Dad, anyway, knew Lloyd George. He also met George Brown, and I really am not talking about Gordon Brown, but the George Brown who became Harold Wilson's deputy as Prime Minister in the 60s and 70s. And he also met Lord Attlee, who was a minister in the Lord Addison, I'm sorry, was Minister of Health in the Attlee government after Nye Bevan, I think, who was on the board of the farm. I haven't quite explained how that worked yet. Interestingly, somebody I do know who's been very active in the trade union movement said, well, if you've ever met Christopher Addison, which I did as a little boy, you're probably the only person who can remember him. And I said, that may be true. He was, he was elderly then. I may add that part of the estate at Boreham, you may, I'm not sure whether you've seen the actual slide, there's an imposing match at Boreham, which is click back. I don't know where it is quite, I wouldn't fiddle with it now.
There's that one there?
You've seen it, yeah, you've seen that one.
Yeah.
Which actually my parents had a little flat in, but it wasn't right at the back. Was reconfigured in the 40s as a co-partnership enterprise, alongside personal shareholders, including my dad. So I used occasionally to say, in Conservative circles, but to choose them rather carefully, I was probably the only Tory MP who was brought up on a cooperative farm. However, another shareholder was the Boreham Institute of Agricultural Engineering, which was established by Ford in the estate and endowed by Ford in the estate mansion Boreham House. And then when counties got involved in forming and setting up colleges of agriculture, that became rather redundant. But in turn, it provided me with some interest from then on. But it was in the 1960s that institute, being essentially redundant as a training institute, was reconfigured as a charitable foundation named after Lord Perry, who'd also been involved with it, with the remit of supporting agricultural efficiency through research. Eventually, after the sale of the main farming business there, I became chair of this Perry Foundation, and I spent many happy hours in the 1980s touring universities, conducting research with an agricultural twist. My favorite visits being to the Department of Electrical Engineering at Sheffield University, where a brilliant research assistant had found out how to zap wild oats or make them stand on end, and to Cambridge, which had the world collection of faba beans and a research program to breed a British baked bean. There is a slight problem because when they did it, they had a distinctive taste, which intruded into the tomato flavoring. We should have really made them more insipid. In parallel with this, and running my own farm in the 1970s, I myself have been keeping a political window open. Marvelously mistyped here as a political widow open. Particularly when one morning in 1984, I was sitting at home at my desk when I was phoned by an old associate, Michael Joplin, now Lord Joplin, who'd become Minister of Agriculture in the Margaret Thatcher's government, with a rather simple request. Europe has agreed to introduce milk quotas to control overproduction this time, not underproduction. Would you like to come in to Whitehall to help us invent them? I think, as Eric Morecambe would have said at the time, there's no real answer to that. So, like Dad, a generation before me, I found myself in Whitehall, this time trying to wrestle with surpluses rather than avoiding national starvation. All I would say in retrospect is I hope, to use Whitehall speak, I didn't foul my nest. And I did enjoy working with civil servants, and I hope I produced some modest value, if only because we actually used to holiday as a family when the kids were young in a German farming area, right down in southern Germany, and could gauge their reaction too. You know, well, my minister's doing this, well, our minister has told us all to push off or whatever. And all this pointed me back towards becoming an MP in 1987, and then being tapped up to serve as, I hasten to say, unpaid public interest member of the Agriculture and Food Research Council because of the Perry Foundation experience. I'm not sure whether they ever realized I had no formal science qualification at all, but I suppose on the basis of learning by doing, my own farming, experience of the Perry Foundation, then the Research Council, plus later time as a higher education, and then an agriculture minister, and later as a select committee member, gave me into some of the insight into some of the skills and high quality of those advising government, both from the technical and administrative viewpoint. It's interesting, on the Perry Foundation, for a long time, we had the chief scientist of the Ministry of Agriculture, then was, who would advise our board, for example, and tell us what to do. Plus the fascination of international contacts with people trying to achieve the best outcome for their own country. So next we'll go on to the next slide, I think. Innovation starts with farmers, and I really want to mention three at this point. The first one, and they're all on this, I think. First one is Jethro Tull, who basically invented the seed drill. I think I would put farmers into a deserved pole position. All these people were agriculturalists, and they developed things to suit their own business. And that's where farmers' innovation and progress starts. And I don't have much to say about diversification tonight, but that's obviously another subject where they've been able to show that. And this is the inventor of the seed drill, Jethro Tull, in the top slide, who spotted, as in the biblical parable, birds eating scattered seeds before they had a chance to take root. And then clicking through, we need to do that. We got him there in the Robert Bakewell, the master cattle breeder of Leicestershire, who constantly experimented with breeding combinations, included and left his mark on a range of farm livestock. This is all 18th century stuff. As a specific instance of farmers' inventiveness, blended with a cautious conservatism, I mentioned the Smythe drill on the right, James Smythe, and his drill, which was made at Peasenhall in Suffolk for almost a century, from the 1950s and into my time. Its successful design remained excellent and unchanged owing to its accurate seed distribution mechanism for all types of seed. The only significant modification was the replacement of horse traces by a tractor drawbar to tow it. However, that is until the 1970s, when I discovered one of my neighbors, actually one of the two brothers-in-law in the anecdote I told earlier, he had modified his Smythe drill by fitting a device to shut off the seed flow from selected rows in order to create modern tram lines for crop production. And then, of course, everyone was doing that with new seed drills as well. And then I think we'll go on to the next slide, slide about science and society. I wanted to also to emphasize leading landowners like Cook of Hope in Norfolk, where the famous Norfolk four-course rotation was developed. A farmer and a far-sighted and determined landowner like Cook could mandate his tenants to follow the rotation and act as what you might call an organizer and a system integrator. I recall visiting a farming area in South Sweden, my best man also another area, being half Swedish, and meeting his cousin, who told me that they still used a rotation based on the Norfolk four-course. And I had to rack my brains to remember how it went. Incidentally, this took place on what I might call a rolling farmer's visit with several locations we had to drive to. That was the last year of Sweden driving on the left. We had missed the stop because we'd been misinformed. And we were driving around the lanes of southern Sweden, trying to find the farms. Suddenly we saw a line of cars in the opposite direction, moving at no more than 15 kph, with passengers and most of their drivers craning out of the window at the passing scene of their neighbour's crops. I said to my friend Eric, we found them, I've seen it all before. Alongside the working farmer and the far-sighted landowner, there developed a tradition of enlightened self-interest among qualified, often affluent countrymen who wanted to drive agriculture forward through applied science, which is, of course, the motto of the Royal Agricultural Society I mentioned. Next slide then, please. And we come on then in the Victorian area to Sir John Bennett Laws, who, on the basis of his fortune made in fertilizers, founded the Rothamsted Research Station, still very much in business now. Its famous Broadwell field challenged convention by being cropped continuously in wheat every year for over a century, still is, or parts of that. Other fields were kept under continuous grassland, all of the components being subject to meticulous observation and record keeping. As one of many positive outcomes, it was discovered that while, as farmers knew, a second wheat crop in succession is never as good as the first. Hence the argument for the rotation of crops. The underlying cause of this phenomenon is the take-all fungus, which builds up and attacks wheat roots. But eventually that in turn declines, so the yields return to a steady state. It's not necessarily the best option, but the more understanding we have of that kind of interaction, the better place we are for making decisions. Go on to slide 13. You may think this is a slight anomaly here, but it's not at all, in my view. The Earl of Selborne, he died last year. He had been chairman of the Agricultural and Food Research Council when I served on it. He was a marvelous man, knew everything you wanted to know about enlightened leadership. He, of course, came from the village Selborne, which is where Gilbert White, the naturalist, lived. I'm sure many of you have been there, it's wonderful. But he'd been able to fit into a long and active life alongside his own estate management and encyclopedic knowledge of fruit trees, a leading role in agricultural science policy. And I think he's very much an unsung hero now. Then perhaps we can get to the next, please. Meanwhile, over here, as it were, with the family, I used to go, because we were still living in Essex then, as a child, on visits with my dad to the Plant Breeding Institute as in Cambridge. And by age 10, I was keen to be a plant breeder. When I went back about 40 years later, I was then an agriculture minister, but I told the then director about my unfulfilled admission. And I had to admit that I'd simply ended up helping to run plant breeding policy rather than actually doing it. But they had star quality there. From the early years of the last century, Sir Rowland Biffin, no slide of this, but the breeder of Little Joswood. And in my own time, we will click through here, John Biffin, I'm so sorry, not John Biffin, who bred a series of superstars, including Huntsman, wheat Huntsman, nothing to do with riding. They were all branded his varieties that he developed, Maris, after the site of the Plant Breeding Institute in Maris Lane. And most were also semi-dwarf. That meant that they put more effort into weighting up the ear to give you more yield, rather than the stem, with a therefore so-called efficient harvest index. In fairness, I would add that the French breeders, notably Desprez, and the Scandinavians provided stiff competition. All genetic development is to some extent a matter of luck, and there are trade-offs, eventually even Huntsman, under disease pressures. As we have moved from a world, at least in rich countries, sadly not elsewhere, where famine seems unlikely to us, today's economic and policy requirements involve less emphasis on crude yields, just go and grow it, and more on cost efficiency, minimization of external inputs, and greater environmental sensitivity. That brings me to as we move towards the final legs of my talk. Next slide, please.
No, this is that one.
Yeah, I think we're I think it is. The impact of public policy on what farmers, landowners, and scientists actually do. For at least 2 millennia, and the more so in that time, since populations increased and concentrated in cities, the primary interest of farmers and policymakers has been to avoid starvation and famine. A related need is to maintain security and resilience of food supplies, and to enable sensible and mutually beneficial trade exchanges which can help food security. They can also introduce an element of diversity in diet. As I wrote this, I was reflecting, it wasn't until my later teens that I'd ever eaten an avocado or a pizza for that matter. You could also argue that there was an element of economic efficiency in spreading food production through the most appropriate areas of the globe. Though equally, I can tell you, farmers are not averse to help with subsidies on their exports. It's all the way back to the medieval period I mentioned. But they're also concerned about the viability of their local communities, particularly as almost universal agricultural employment has dropped. I was reading some stuff on India before I came out. It's very interesting to see how it affects their political system there. I think we'll go on from that to the next slide.
All is not lost.
Yeah, all is not lost. No, well, that's always a good sign. I think we've slipped on a bit, but what I'm going to do is just read to you from a bit, and then we'll get on to All Is Not Lost. And then we're nearly over. You've been very patient. Now, on the medium-sized Essex farm of my childhood, that's the one my dad moved to, we used to employ about 10 full-time plus casual labour for picking. Now, on the estate that he'd run before that, when I was a little boy, there were at least 200 employees and many casuals, because a lot of it was market garden. For many years at Ainhoe, we ran a mixed farm of crops and livestock with 2 full-time employees, everybody helping out at plum harvest time. My own 3 children helping their granny with direct sales at the gate. It's always rather nice when people came along and said, "Have you got Ainhoe plums for sale?" And we said, "Yes, of course." Well, we'd like to come down from London and have a little drive out and buy our plums. Very, very good for morale. And in recent years, we've outsourced the whole operation of our farm in Ainhoe to a neighbour with big equipment on a contract basis, trail farming basis. So we have some help and employed help with a holiday-let diversification. And in recent years, there is renewed and heightened interest among the visiting public in the environment and appropriate land use. And the first time I picked this up was when we were doing the plum direct sales. And people used to say, "Well, where are they?" And you'd say, "Well, they're up there as the auction if you want to see it. And what do? You know, do you use any sprays?" And we explain. I think all these factors that I've mentioned have developed and modified the interest of the public in the application of scientific observation and knowledge. There are, of course, divergent and almost schizophrenic views. People want natural food, but they want it free of blemishes and with good a shelf life at the same time. They certainly want to know what is happening in the country and where their money as taxpayers is being directed. In terms of scientific activity, there's been a large amount of consolidation of the ongoing efforts I've referred to into publicly financed institutions. So, alongside this, public policy has evolved. Henry Ford's Boreham Institute of Agricultural Engineering was rendered redundant by the growth of local agricultural colleges in most counties. The BBSRC, the Research Council, spends annually roughly 100 times as much as the Perry Foundation. It's always useful to have independent players, and the Royal Society, the Royal Agricultural Society, remains proudly independent. Fortunately, generally, all of this has generated more general political interest than ideology. I've cited a clutch of political figures, slightly surprisingly from the left and from the centre of politics, usually from urban background, with whom my dad had perfectly amicable dealings, largely around the shared objective then of increasing food production. Perhaps the biggest distinction now developing lies between the comparatively small number of political decision makers who have experience and sympathy with rural affairs and those who lack this, even if they're not actually hostile to it. Farmers realize that their numbers and their electoral influence have diminished, let alone also their media profile, Jeremy Clarkson being an exception. And it makes them uncomfortable, even if it's countries with large remaining peasant populations like India and Sicily, where that discomfort usually spills onto the street. Now we come to All Is Not Lost. Along the way, I remain something of an optimist. I've been arguing that most farmers have and always have had an innovative and entrepreneurial side. They do take heed of scientific and technical information, and they prefer at least some stability and sensitivity from the government of the day, even if at the same time they probably think things are going downhill from a golden past and don't take too much for granted. Perhaps in turn, they do look to remind everyone that agriculture is business, not merely a recreation, and that it's founded on a successful economic model. Unless it works economically, you won't get the benefits or the supply that consumers want. And so we come to one of my dad's favorite lines, which is slide 20. here we are. That's him in his prime. One day we'll go out to cut the crop and find we haven't planted. I think he was right. And I've really finished now. I'm just going to go to the final slide, which is ahead of questions. I just did that one. Because it occurred to me when we were going through our archive photos and things, you might like to see this. That would have been taken about 1972. It shows my dad, Eric Boswell, his wife, Joan Nay Jones, George Jones's daughter, family's daughter. The family dog, he was called Sock. And if you're interested in the academic side of it, that's short for Socrates. And yours truly standing up looking a bit gangly and awkward. And a very small baby, aged about 2 months. Victoria, no Boswell, now Prentice. So whatever else my father got right or didn't, he ended up being the father of one Minister of Agriculture and now the grandfather of another one. I thought you'd be amused. And that, when you're ready, it really opens it up to questions if you'd like.
Okay.
Anyone want to put their head on the block? Yes.
Zoom users can type in messages.
Yes, of course.
and I'll read it. Have you spent time looking at what is happening to our soil? I know there are major concerns farmers about the life of soil and that its productivity will die off in our lifetime.
Well, that's right to identify. I can pray one political colleague in aid. And for this purpose, you ought to know, when I went to the House of Lords, I found myself doing a little thing called the European Union Committee as the chairman of it. And I was actually an officer of the House of Lords. So I haven't taken a whip from everyone. So I'm not giving you politics tonight. But one of Victoria's colleagues is Rebecca Powell, ministerial colleague, happens to be a soil scientist, which is good idea. I mean, I think it's very fortunate. Yes, I think we have a problem. I think we had a model which was, if you like, based on the Common Agricultural Policy, which was very much a hangover from wartime shortages. Because I used to say, you know, if you went to southern Germany or you went to France, people were ruddy well starving during the war. You know, they knew about it. It wasn't in theory. And I think that has lingered on. And I think it's meant that for a long time we had a model which emphasized, somebody once said to me, I mean, when I was sort of learning my trade as a farmer, which for various reasons I did on the job, really. You know, if you ever get in a mess, you can get some spray or another bag of fertilizer, and that will get you out of it. That's true up to a point. But I think systemically, we've got to look at our natural resources, and that is soil. And that is very much coming into some of the changes of policy which are now coming on in UK. And I think will happen in other countries as well. So thank you.
Question here from John McCormick. What do you think is the balance between genetically modified food to increase yields and the desire of people for natural organic foods?
I think that is a terrific question, even if delivered from the Australian subcontinent. Yeah, it's all right. I've got lots of cousins there, so I have to take out insurance. First of all, this is a small sort of correction into the debate. And I'm not trying to derail this question because it's really important. It makes us awful. There are two sorts of gene modification. I think we've got ourselves into a sort of political corner by talking about genetic modification and Franken foods and all this, which is where you, as it were, put an additional gene in.
I noticed the new phrase is genetic editing.
Well, that's different. That's the one that is different. Because gene modification, you could, I don't know, I mean, I'm not a geneticist. As I said, I gave that up when I was about 10. But you could, in theory, sort of graft a pig's gene into a wheat plant because you wanted to do something. And I can understand there's a bit of a yuck factor about that in people's minds. I think that's unacceptable. Now, so-called gene editing is actually a kind of chemical scissors. It enables you to remove a gene that is creates a susceptibility, like, oh, I don't know, the wheat susceptibility to take all fungus. I'm not sure if they crack that yet. And you can then, in effect, concentrate on the genes which are good genes, and you can have something which hasn't been, as it were, contaminated by external genetic material. And whether you call that, I mean, I'm in favor of being honest with labeling, whether you call that actually gene modification or not, I don't know. I think it is, a lot of people feel more comfortable about it, but they still need to be told what's happening. Thank you, John. Anything else?
I wonder, do you have any reflections on the problem that we have here in the Cotswolds, going to lots of other areas of the UK as well, but particularly bad in the Cotswolds, whereby many of our landowners are no longer really farmers. They purchase the land, and many of them due to tax breaks. And the impact that it has not just on the recreational use of the land, but also on productivity of the land. You talk yourself about your own family and the way that your land is now farmed by another.
Yeah.
What do you think the long-term consequences are, and what lessons can we learn, and how do we get ourselves out?
I think, again, that's a very perceptive question. I don't think it necessarily is a particular kind of optimal agricultural structure that everyone needs to do it, because some people who buy land, even like Dyson, shall we say, who buy, you know, to use their money up, are quite committed to, or have advisors who are committed to agriculture. I think the test is really about what you might call community involvement. If you can have a sense in which people are still able to feel they have a handle or involvement in something, as opposed to having purely external people they've never heard of and never seen, who take no interest, then I think that's a model that's manageable. But how you actually legislate for that is not easy.
We should be encouraging tax breaks for landowners that don't really relate to farming, but more relate to tax breaks.
Well, there can be some difficulties, including where people say realise land for development and then want to wash their capital gains out by rolling it over. And I think you've got to keep an eye on this constantly. But again, it's a bit like the dilemma which is actually happening, to make a political reference at the moment, about windfall taxes. You know, you've got to be a bit careful you don't kill off the investment in the process of doing this. But I think you're entirely right to point that out.
But targeting,
Well, I think that's right.
I think James Dyson's point was that you can damage farming for food production if you put all the emphasis on green goods and planting trees and big bombs and that sort of.
Well, I think there's a genuine dilemma, how much you want to concentrate on what for shorthand I call the rewilding people, or how much you want to sign up to country farm. I don't mean I mean, you know, I know slightly and like Adam Henson. I'm not saying there's something wrong with that in principle, but it's got to be moderated by the fact that you do need an economic model. I mean, you don't want to be in a position where you go out to cut the crop and found one way or another either the rats have eaten it or nobody planted it in the first place. Yeah, both ways. Did you?
Me?
Yeah, no, that's right.
I was thinking. Yes.
Sorry, I didn't want to.
What is the base CO for, you know, cattle to arable farming in this country? And do you think it's going to change in the future to more arable?
I think there's something of a shift back, because I mean, if you're not simply doing an output model that says, you know, you may remember, I'm thinking of the Cotswolds, people used to talk about barley barons. If you've got enough acres that you could load up with spring barley, you didn't really have to mind about anything else. It was a monoculture. For the reasons that have been discussed about the soil, and to some extent the incentives which are being remolded now in Britain, we're moving away from output. I mean, this is, dig for Britain and dig for victory sort of thing. It's driven a lot of policies in the past. And we're looking at the health of soils and other things and the environment. I think the main thing is that those should be done where it is doable by most ordinary farmers. You don't have to be a PhD. You don't have to have 5 million quid spare that you can sort of indulge yourself to create a country park. Great if you've got that and you want to do it. But you've got to tailor it between what you might call aspirational, as it were, species recovery and things, which is provided for under the new schemes, and what most farmers should be able to manage on their own land. And one of the ways in which they will maintain soil health and also keep their costs down is if they reintroduce some kind of element of mixed farming. I mean, we've always maintained that because I didn't go into the detail, but I mean, I hated selling our cows. We had some pedigree cattle actually, some South Devons, a bit too big for modern conditions. But when we did that, I mean, we also had the motorway to come with. So it was a complicated time in the early 90s, let's put it that way. But even then, we have another neighbouring dairy farm, and we used to grow grass lays for him, for his cattle, and we had deals on muck coming back. So, it's not a purely arable, tip the bag of fertilizer up rotation. I think much more of that will happen. I hope so. Now, something you come in again.
Broad question really about the trust between farmers and essentially politics in general, politicians in general. But an example comes to mind. My brother lives in South Italy, an olive producing country. It's one of the main crops there. And there's
That's got serious disease.
Sorry?
Is it Xylella? It's got terrible disease.
Yes, that's the one. Where the poor farmers owning these trees for tens and hundreds of years, very ancient trees. The trees are dying, essentially from the inside out. But the farmers don't necessarily believe the politicians. There isn't a real trust with the politicians. They think it's some kind of trick. It's some kind of scam that for them to grub up their valued olive trees that have been in their family for generations. So the trust, I don't know, isn't there or wasn't there? Do you see any kind of parallel with what's going on in the UK? Or is there this trust in
I think it's a special problem in Italy. I mean, I'm not really familiar with the Italian language. I know a bit of culture. In fact, one daughter, Caroline, who's the IT specialist, she's Italian speaking, and one of our granddaughters, Victoria's older one, is Italian speaking as well. I think there's a huge difference between the north and the south of Italy. Amazingly enough, I was trying to read something about that yesterday as it happened. And you look at productivity and so forth and incomes, much lower in the south, very much related to lack of trust in government. I think you've all got to make your own judgment about recent events here. I take the view that on the whole, you should be straight with people. I mean, insofar as I've influenced anybody, I've said, over the pandemic, you have to tell it how it is and say it's going to be quite difficult. And we'll do our best and you do the best. And we'll see. I think farmers slightly indulge a bit in sort of the good old days I mentioned. And I mean, you will get, if we had a farmer, if I was talking to a farmer, I'll bet somebody would get up and say, it wasn't like this in Tom Williams's day. Tom Williams was the Labour minister in the Ackley government from 1945 to 1950. He's actually an extremely interesting man because he was he came from Doncaster and was he was a miner, I think. But I mean, he was a genuine Labour man and they adored him. But of course, he had the easiest run because all you had to do was just increase own food production. I don't think it was easy, but so people say it's wonderful, you know, and you say, well, it's not quite as it was then. It wouldn't even be if you had a Labour minister. That's probably true, but I think in a way farmers sort of have an ability to grumble and trust at the same time. I don't know how I would put it like that, but delicately, I do hear the odd anecdote, which I find interesting. Now, how are we doing?
Well, any more questions?
My mind has gone back to Jeremy Clarkson again. He saw his programs. I think it was £150 profit he made in 1 year's farming of 4,000 acres.
Yes.
So he wants to diversify, and he's got his little shop. He'd like to shove a restaurant on the side of it to sell local produce, not least from our village butcher who supplies his meat. And yet the locals are stopping him doing it. And again, we've got this conflict. I mean, you mentioned that you were selling Ainel apples, was it?
Oh.
Plums, way back, and you might have had a 10 or a dozen people go out to London to buy them.
Yeah.
He's having hundreds of people.
I know. Well, for what it's worth, Victoria's paid a state visit there.
Oh, right.
No. But the one thing, it was never in my never worth my time as an MP getting involved in local planning. So we can forget that Oxfordshire's got to sort that one out.
They're all vegans.
Well, there is an element of that, and that's quite a concerning issue. And I mean, the answer to that is to come back and explain and show, and actually give people the opportunity to taste it. Now, whether or not he succeeds there, I think the instinct of adding value by diversifying to local produce is a very good one. I think we will see a lot more of it, but we still have a slightly uneasy relationship. I'm not surprised he didn't make more money at the time, because I've never had a Lamborghini tractor or a car of that kind. And I think it was, but he was making a point, and I think the point that he's making is not perhaps the one that people have spotted. I'm sorry to be autobiographical, or as it were biographical, but the daughter I haven't really mentioned, my middle daughter, Emily, who teaches, as a deputy head. She, because I was a member of the Farmers Club in London, she could occasionally stay overnight, you know, in one of the guest rooms. So she got into the habit of going to the Farmers Club under 30s group, and she is pretty academic. That's her background. But she really realized without notice that there were a lot of very bright people having to deal with extremely complicated biological, economic, animal health and other challenges and reputational challenges. And she, I think it gave me a great deal of pleasure, and I think a great deal of satisfaction to her. She was elected as the under 30s chairman at that stage. So I had to read this magazine every month with chairman, under 30s chairman's jotting was in, which was Emily Appine. But the point I'm trying to make is that farming, you know, whether it's carried out on a Welsh hillside or in the flatlands of East Anglia, is a very complicated business. And oversimplifying it doesn't do anyone any good. Equally, making it a little bit more complicated and interesting might give you a profit center for making more money in the future.
Well, no more questions, it appears. I don't know that's whether because you've answered them all or because are you checking there, Nigel?
Yeah, okay, that's fine. That's
Right.
Well, thank you both, Richard and
I think,
Nigel, very much for
operating the kit for us.
Well, I think we should thank you for putting up with us not operating the kit in various times, but anyway, and thanks to the audience for getting us out of a couple of things there.
Yeah.
Right, thank you very much then, Tim.
Pleasure.
I think we'll